My parents kicked me out at 16 for being obsessed with video games instead of studying. "You'll never amount to anything playing those stupid games," my dad screamed as I packed my bags. 3 years later, I just signed a $2 million esports contract, and they're blowing up my phone begging me to come home. I'm Alex, 19, and I'm currently one of the top professional gamers in North America. But this story starts when I was 16, and my parents thought I was throwing my life away playing video games instead of focusing on what they considered real education. My parents, Robert and Linda, are both accountants who met in college and built what they considered a respectable middle-class life. Dad works for a tax firm. Mom handles bookkeeping for small businesses. They live in the same suburban house, drive sensible cars, and plan everything around financial security. From the time I could hold a controller, I was obsessed with video games. Not just playing them, but understanding them. How they worked, what made some players better than others, the strategy and psychology behind competitive gaming. My parents saw it as a waste of time, a distraction from homework and sports and the activities they thought would lead to college scholarships and stable careers. They set time limits, took away my console as punishment, constantly nagged about balance. By 14, I was already ranking in the top percentiles of several competitive games. I started making YouTube videos analyzing gameplay, building a small but dedicated following. My bedroom was set up like a command center with multiple monitors and streaming equipment I'd saved for. That's when the real fighting started. My parents couldn't understand why I'd spend my allowance on gaming gear instead of clothes or whatever normal teenagers bought. They'd lecture me about living in the real world and developing practical skills. The breaking point came during my sophomore year when I qualified for a regional tournament with a $10,000 prize pool. It was on a weekend, meant missing one day of school, and required traveling to Chicago with some older players I'd met online. My parents absolutely lost their minds. Dad said I was becoming obsessed with fantasy, that I needed to focus on subjects that would actually matter for college applications. Mom worried about safety, traveling with strangers to compete in what she called glorified video games. When I showed them the tournament information, the legitimate organizations involved, the potential prize money, they dismissed it all as pipe dreams. Dad said even if I won, which was unlikely, it was just a fluke that wouldn't lead to any real career opportunities. I went to the tournament anyway, forging their permission signature and borrowing money from my part-time job to cover travel expenses. My parents grounded me when I got back, even after I finished third place and won $1,200. That money was the first I'd ever earned from gaming, and it felt like validation that I wasn't crazy. I'd competed against players from across the country and held my own, but my parents saw it as proof I was prioritizing the wrong things. The fighting escalated through spring semester. My grades were decent, mostly B's with some A's in subjects I cared about, but my parents wanted straight A's. They couldn't understand that I was already working toward a career, just not one they recognized. They started getting more controlling, installed parental controls on our internet, set a timer on my gaming setup, threatened to throw away my equipment if my grades didn't improve. The more they pushed, the more I pulled away. I was streaming regularly by then, had built an audience of a few thousand followers who watched me play and appreciated my strategic breakdowns. I was earning small amounts from donations and sponsorships, maybe $200 to $300 a month. To me, that was proof of concept. I was 16 years old and earning money doing something I loved, building skills that professional teams were starting to value. To my parents, it was distraction from real goals like SAT prep and extracurricular activities. The final explosion came in May when I got invited to try out for a semi-professional team based in California. They wanted me to spend the summer training with them, living in a gaming house with other prospects, preparing for professional leagues. When I told my parents, my dad went ballistic, started yelling about how I was delusional, that video games weren't real jobs, that I was throwing away my future for fantasies, said I needed to grow up and stop living in a dream world. I tried explaining the business side of esports, how much money professional players made, how the industry was growing, showed them articles about college scholarships for gaming, professional contracts worth millions. They wouldn't listen. Mom started crying, saying she'd failed as a parent if I thought playing games was more important than education. Dad said if I couldn't see how destructive this obsession was, maybe I needed to learn the hard way. That's when he gave me an ultimatum. Stop gaming completely, focus on school, spend summer preparing for senior year like a normal student, or find somewhere else to live. He said no son of his was going to waste his life playing children's games. I was 16 and stupid and angry, so I called his bluff, told him I was tired of fighting with people who couldn't see what was right in front of them, that I'd rather take my chances following my passion than live their boring, safe life. He told me to pack my bags, said I'd be back within a month, begging them to take me back, ready to be realistic about my future. Mom stood behind him, still crying, but not arguing with his decision. I packed everything I could fit in 2 suitcases and my gaming laptop, left behind my desktop setup, most of my clothes, everything that wouldn't fit in my friend Tyler's car when he picked me up that night. Tyler's parents let me crash in their basement for 2 weeks while I figured out my next move. I called the team in California, explained my situation, asked if the tryout offer was still open even though I was now technically homeless. The team manager Marcus was surprisingly understanding. Said several players had family issues over gaming careers, that it came with the territory. He arranged for me to fly out early, start training immediately, and stay in their gaming house. That first summer was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Training 8 to 10 hours a day, competing against players who'd been grinding longer than me, living with strangers who weren't always supportive. But I was doing what I loved. I made the team roster by August, started earning a small salary, enough to cover basic expenses, plus performance bonuses when we won tournaments. Not rich by any means, but enough to prove this was real work with real income. My parents called twice that first month, not to apologize or check if I was okay, but to ask when I was coming home to prepare for senior year. I told them I was homeschooling online while training professionally. Dad's response was that I was ruining my life, that I'd never be able to support myself playing games, that I needed to come home and finish high school properly. When I mentioned my salary, he laughed and said it wouldn't last. I stopped answering their calls after that, focused on improving my gameplay, building my streaming audience, proving that I could make this work. The team helped me finish high school online while maintaining my professional training schedule. By 18, I was a starter for one of the top teams in our league. We won several major tournaments. I was earning 6 figures between salary and prize money, and brands were starting to reach out about sponsorship deals. My streaming audience had grown to over 100,000 followers. Companies were paying me to play their games, review their products, appear at gaming conventions. I was making more money than most people my age dreamed of, but I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. Part of me wanted them to see how wrong they'd been, how successful I'd become doing exactly what they'd told me was impossible. The breakthrough came when our team qualified for the World Championship with a $5 million total prize pool. We were one of the favorites to win, and gaming media was profiling all the players. The article about me mentioned my hometown, my parents' names, my journey from kicked-out teenager to professional gamer. It was picked up by local news stations, shared on social media, seen by everyone who'd known me growing up. That's when my phone started buzzing constantly. Calls, texts, voicemails from my parents, relatives, old classmates, neighbors. Everyone suddenly wanted to congratulate me on my success, though most had ignored or criticized me when I was struggling. My parents' messages started apologetic, said they'd seen the news coverage, were proud of how far I'd come, wanted to rebuild our relationship, but I could tell they still didn't really understand what I did for a living. I didn't respond immediately. I was focused on preparing for the biggest tournament of my career, potentially worth over $1 million if we won. The last thing I needed was family drama affecting my performance. We finished second at Worlds, earning $750,000 for the team to split plus individual bonuses. My personal share was about $180,000, more than my parents made combined in a year. The gaming press called it a breakthrough performance. That's when the calls became more desperate. My parents were apparently bragging to neighbors about their successful son, the professional gamer they'd always supported. The revisionist history was incredible to witness. I finally answered one of their calls just to see what they'd say. Dad immediately started with how proud he was, how he'd always known I had special talents, how he'd supported my gaming from the beginning. The gaslighting was so blatant I almost hung up. This was the same man who'd called gaming a waste of life, who'd kicked me out for pursuing exactly this career. Now he was taking credit for my success. Mom got on the phone crying again, but happy tears this time. Said she'd missed me so much, that she wanted to hear about everything I'd been doing, that they'd love to visit California and see my life there. I listened to them rewrite history for 20 minutes. According to their new version, they'd been supportive but concerned parents who'd wanted me to have backup plans. They'd never kicked me out. I'd chosen to leave to pursue my dreams. When I finally spoke, I asked if they remembered the ultimatum. The demand that I stop gaming completely or find somewhere else to live. The prediction that I'd be back begging within a month. There was silence. Then Dad said they'd been worried about my education, that they'd wanted me to finish high school properly, that they'd never expected me to become so successful so quickly. More revisionist history. They weren't apologizing for being wrong, just reframing their actions as protective rather than dismissive, still not taking responsibility for kicking out their teenage son. I told them I needed time to process everything, that I'd call them back when I was ready. What I really needed was time to decide whether reconciliation was worth the emotional energy. 3 months later, I signed the biggest contract in my esports career. $2 million guaranteed over 2 years, plus performance bonuses and streaming revenue sharing. The announcement made gaming news websites and even some mainstream sports media. That's when my parents' desperation reached peak levels. Daily calls, long emails, showing up at gaming events trying to reconnect. They'd apparently been telling everyone in town about their son, the millionaire gamer. The final straw came when they ambushed me at a tournament in Las Vegas. Just showed up at the venue with press credentials they'd somehow obtained, trying to get backstage access as my family. Security called me to verify, and I had to explain that these people weren't welcome. The incident was embarrassing enough that tournament organizers had to escort them out. Photos ended up on social media. That night I got a barrage of messages. Relatives taking their side, saying I was cruel to reject family who just wanted to reconnect. Friends of theirs claiming I was ungrateful, that I owed my success to their sacrifice and support. The narrative they'd created was incredible. They were the devoted parents whose game gamer son had become successful beyond anyone's imagination. I was the ungrateful child who'd forgotten where I came from. I decided to set the record straight, posted a detailed timeline on social media explaining exactly what had happened, their ultimatum, kicking me out, their predictions of failure, their complete lack of contact until I became successful. The post went viral in gaming communities. Thousands of comments from people sharing similar stories of family members who dismissed their gaming careers until money got involved. The support was overwhelming, but it also brought more attention than I wanted. Gaming journalists started investigating the story, interviewing my parents, writing articles about family relationships and esports. The whole thing became a case study. My parents responded by going on local news, claiming I was exaggerating for attention. Said they'd always been supportive, that any disagreements were normal parent-teenager conflicts that I was blowing out of proportion. Watching them lie on television was surreal. They seemed to genuinely believe their revised version of events, where they were caring parents dealing with a difficult but talented child who'd ultimately succeeded. I finally agreed to meet them in person, but only with a mediator present. Family therapy session to address the disconnect between their memory and mine, to see if honest reconciliation was possible. The session was brutal. When confronted with specific examples of their behavior, they either denied them completely or reframed them as protective parenting. They couldn't admit to being wrong about gaming as a career. What hurt most was their continued inability to see my perspective. Even faced with my obvious success, they still viewed gaming as ultimately frivolous. They were proud of my money, not my accomplishments. I realized then that reconciliation would require me to pretend their version of events was accurate, to let them take credit for supporting dreams they'd actually tried to destroy. I wasn't willing to do that. I made a final decision, told them I was grateful for the lessons they'd taught me about self-reliance and independence, even if those weren't the lessons they'd intended. But I didn't need parents who could only love me after I became successful. They protested that they'd always loved me, that money didn't matter, that they just wanted their son back, but their actions had shown otherwise. They'd loved their idea of who I should be, not who I actually was. I moved forward without them, used my platform to mentor young gamers dealing with family pressure, helped establish a scholarship fund for esports players estranged from families, turned my experience into something positive. 5 years later, I'm one of the most successful players in my game's history, own a gaming organization, invest in esports startups, have built generational wealth doing exactly what my parents said was impossible. My parents still try to contact me occasionally, usually around holidays or when I achieve some new milestone that makes news, always with the same energy, proud parents wanting to reconnect with their successful son. But I've built my own family now, teammates who've been through similar struggles, friends who understood my passion from the beginning, a girlfriend who fell in love with me when I was still grinding to make rent. The parents who kicked me out for playing video games missed watching me become everything they'd said I'd never be. They chose to be absent during my struggle, so they don't get to be present during my success. Their prediction that I'd come begging within a month was wrong. I built something better than anything they could have given me. Independence, success, and the knowledge that I'd proven every doubt wrong through pure determination. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming so successful that the people who rejected you spend the rest of their lives trying to convince everyone they supported you all along. The 16-year-old they kicked out for playing video games grew up to prove that passion plus persistence can overcome any prediction, even the ones that come from the people who were supposed to believe in you most. 7 years after signing that first major contract, I received an email that changed everything. It wasn't from my parents, but from my 14-year-old cousin Jake, my dad's brother's son. He'd found my business email through my gaming organization's website. The email was simple but heartbreaking. Jake was going through exactly what I'd experienced at his age. Obsessed with competitive gaming, showing real talent, but facing constant pressure from his parents to focus on traditional academics instead. He'd heard family whispers about what happened between me and my parents, though the details had been sanitized over the years. He knew I'd become successful in gaming, but didn't understand the full story of how I'd gotten there. Jake asked if I could give him advice about dealing with parents who didn't understand gaming careers. He was ranking in the top 1% of players his age, but his parents were threatening to take away his computer if his grades didn't improve. Reading his email felt like looking into a mirror from 7 years ago. Same passion, same family pressure, same feeling of being misunderstood by the people who were supposed to support him most. I called Jake that same day. Hearing the excitement in his voice when he realized he was actually talking to his famous gaming cousin was both heartwarming and sad. He'd been following my career secretly, watching my streams when his parents weren't around. During our conversation, I learned that my parents had been telling extended family a completely different version of our story. According to them, I'd always been passionate about technology. They'd supported my interests, and my success was the natural result of their encouraging parenting. Jake was confused because his parents kept using me as an example of why he should focus on school first. They'd say things like, Alex got good grades before he started gaming professionally, and Alex's parents made sure he had backup plans. The revisionist history had spread through the entire family. I'd become their poster child for balanced parenting, leading to unconventional success, when the reality me was that I'd succeeded despite their complete lack of support. I decided to visit Jake and set the record straight. Flew back to my hometown for the first time since that disastrous tournament incident in Vegas 3 years earlier. Jake's parents, my Uncle Tom and Aunt Sarah, were shocked to see me but tried to play it cool. They clearly hadn't expected me to show up in person, and there was this awkward dance of trying to be welcoming while also defensive. Over dinner, I listened to them explain their concerns about Jake's gaming. Same arguments I'd heard from my own parents years earlier. Worried about addiction, social isolation, lack of real-world skills, uncertain career prospects. But unlike my parents, they were at least willing to listen when I explained the current state of the esports industry, the scholarships available, the legitimate career paths, the business opportunities surrounding competitive gaming. I showed them Jake's rankings, explained what his skill level meant in terms of potential opportunities, offered to mentor him properly, help him balance gaming development with academic responsibilities, provide real guidance instead of just passion. Uncle Tom asked the question I'd been waiting for. What really happened between you and your parents? Because they tell a very different story about how supportive they were. So I told them everything. The ultimatum, getting kicked out, the complete lack of contact until I became successful, the attempts to rewrite history. Jake's parents were visibly uncomfortable as the real story unfolded. Aunt Sarah finally said what everyone was thinking. Your parents have been telling people they always believed in your gaming career, that they helped you get started and supported you through the difficult early years. The family mythology had become so entrenched that even relatives who should have known better had accepted the sanitized version. My parents had become the heroes of my success story instead of the obstacles I'd overcome. Jake was sitting there processing everything, realizing that the example his parents had been using to pressure him was built on lies. His famous gaming cousin hadn't succeeded because of family support, but in spite of family rejection. I made a decision that night. Instead of just helping Jake privately, I was going to use my platform to tell the real story publicly. Not for revenge, but to help other young gamers facing similar family pressure. I started a YouTube series called Family vs. Gaming, where I interviewed successful esports professionals about their relationships with parents who hadn't understood their career choices. The response was incredible. Story after story of talented young players facing ultimatums, getting kicked out, losing family support for pursuing gaming careers, but also stories of eventual reconciliation, of parents learning to understand, of families that had found ways to bridge the gap. The series went viral beyond gaming communities. Mainstream media picked up on it as a story about generational differences, changing career landscapes, and family relationships in the digital age. That's when my parents finally reached out again, but this time through my business manager. They wanted to appear on the show to correct misconceptions about our relationship and share their side of the story. I agreed, but only on condition that it would be a full interview covering everything. No edited highlights, no predetermined narrative, just honest conversation about what had happened and how we'd all handled it. The interview was scheduled for 3 months later, giving them time to prepare and me time to decide exactly what I wanted to accomplish. This wasn't about humiliating them, but about honest accountability. During those 3 months, more family members reached out. Cousins, aunts, uncles who'd heard different versions of my story over the years and wanted to understand what had really happened. Some were supportive, apologizing for believing my parents' version without questioning it. Others were defensive, saying I was being unfair by bringing up old disagreements publicly. The family was essentially splitting along generational lines. My grandmother, my dad's mother, called me directly for the first time in years. She'd watched some of my YouTube series and wanted to talk. At 78, she was surprisingly open-minded about gaming careers and apologetic about the family's treatment of me. She revealed something I hadn't known. My parents had borrowed money from her several times over the years, always with promises to pay it back when dad got promoted or mom's business picked up. They'd never mentioned my success as a reason they could afford to repay her. Even more revealing, they'd specifically asked her not to contact me directly because it might interfere with their attempts to reconcile. They'd been controlling the family narrative about our relationship for years. The interview date arrived. My parents showed up at my gaming facility looking older, more nervous than I'd ever seen them. This wasn't their territory, and being surrounded by my team, my success, my world, made their past dismissal of it even more stark. We spent 4 hours talking. For the first time since I was 16, they had to confront their actual words and actions without being able to reframe them. The footage was raw, emotional, and completely honest. They struggled to admit they'd been wrong about gaming as a career, though they acknowledged that my success proved them incorrect. They couldn't bring themselves to apologize for kicking me out, still framing it as tough love that had motivated me to succeed. Most painfully, they still couldn't understand why their lack of support during my struggling years mattered more than their pride in my eventual success. They genuinely thought showing up now should be enough. The interview went live unedited, all 4 hours available for anyone to watch. The gaming community's response was overwhelmingly supportive, but mainstream reaction was more mixed. Some viewers felt I was being too harsh on parents who were clearly trying to reconnect. Others saw it as a powerful example of how family conditional love can damage relationships permanently. My parents received both criticism and support support from viewers. Some people related to their concerns about unconventional careers, while others were appalled by their behavior toward their teenage son. But the most important response came from young gamers and their families. Parents reached out saying the interview had helped them understand their children's passion better. Young players thanked me for showing them they weren't alone. Jake's situation improved dramatically after his parents watched the interview. They started taking his gaming more seriously, helped him set up a proper practice schedule, even attended some of his local tournaments. 6 months later, Jake qualified for a major junior tournament with a scholarship prize pool. His parents were in the audience cheering, something I'd never experienced during my own competitive journey. The Family vs. Gaming series became a documentary that premiered at film festivals and eventually streamed on Netflix. The family relationship aspect resonated with audiences beyond gaming, touching on broader themes about supporting children's unconventional dreams. My parents tried to capitalize on the attention, offering interviews to media outlets about their famous son and their journey to understanding his career. But their version still focused more on their growth than their mistakes. I made peace with that limitation. They would never fully acknowledge the damage their rejection had caused, never truly apologize for the years of dismissal and ultimatums. But they'd been forced to confront the reality of their choices. More importantly, their story had become a cautionary tale that helped other families avoid similar mistakes. Young gamers sent me messages saying their parents had watched our interview and started supporting their gaming goals as a result. The scholarship fund I'd established grew into a full foundation supporting young esports players from unsupportive families. We provided not just financial assistance, but mentorship, family mediation services, and educational resources for parents. 10 years after being kicked out for playing video games, I'd built an empire that employed hundreds of people and supported thousands of young gamers pursuing their dreams. The foundation had helped over 500 families bridge the gap between traditional expectations and gaming careers. My relationship with my parents remained distant but cordial. They attended major tournaments sometimes, proud to be associated with my success, but still unable to fully understand the journey that had led there. Jake, now 18, had received multiple scholarship offers from colleges with strong esports programs. His parents had become some of the most supportive gaming parents I knew, completely transformed by understanding what they'd almost missed. At his high school graduation, Jake gave a speech about following unconventional dreams and thanking the family members who'd supported him along the way. He specifically mentioned his cousin who'd shown him that success was possible, even when others doubted. Sitting in that audience, watching my cousin graduate with full family support for his gaming aspirations, I realized that my parents' rejection had ultimately led to something far more valuable than their acceptance could have provided. I'd become the mentor I'd needed at 16. The foundation I'd built was supporting hundreds of young gamers who might otherwise face the same choice I'd been given: abandon their dreams or lose their families. The parents who'd kicked me out for playing video games had accidentally created an advocate for thousands of young players facing similar rejection. Their failure to believe in me had become my motivation to believe in others. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the most painful experiences. My parents' ultimatum had forced me to prove that love and support could come from chosen family when biological family failed to provide it. The gaming prodigy they'd rejected at 16 had grown into someone who ensured no other young player would have to choose between their dreams and their family's love, at least not without support and alternatives. That transformation felt like the best possible response to their prediction that I'd never amount to anything playing video games. I'd amounted to exactly what they'd feared most, someone who proved them completely wrong. 15 years after being kicked out, I received an invitation that would complete the circle in the most unexpected way. The International Olympic Committee had officially recognized esports as a medal event, and I was being asked to serve on the selection committee for the first Olympic gaming team. The irony was overwhelming. The video games my parents had dismissed as worthless were now being recognized at the highest level of international competition. Athletes who trained exactly like I had would be representing their countries on the world's biggest stage. When the news broke, every major media outlet wanted to interview the gaming pioneer who'd been rejected by his own family. My story had become symbolic of how quickly society's attitudes toward new careers could change. My parents, now in their 60s, watched the announcement on national television. For the first time, they saw their son being discussed alongside Olympic athletes, his expertise valued by international sporting organizations. They called me that night, not to congratulate me, but to ask if I could get them tickets to the Olympics. The audacity was almost amusing after all these years. I told them tickets weren't the issue. The issue was that they'd spent 15 years unable to genuinely acknowledge their mistakes or understand why their early rejection had mattered more than their later pride. But something had shifted in my own perspective. At 31, I was no longer the angry teenager seeking validation from parents who couldn't provide it. I'd built something far more meaningful than their approval. The foundation had grown into a global organization with offices in 12 countries. We'd helped over 2,000 families navigate conflicts between traditional career expectations and gaming aspirations. The scholarship program had funded education aspirations for hundreds of young players. More importantly, we'd change the conversation. Parents who once would have dismissed gaming careers now came to our workshops to understand the industry. Schools were adding esports programs. Colleges were offering full scholarships for competitive gaming. My relationship with Jake had evolved into something like an older brother mentoring a younger sibling. He'd graduated college with a degree in sports management while maintaining his competitive gaming career. Exactly the kind of balanced approach I'd never had the family support to develop. Jake was now working for my foundation, helping design programs for the next generation of young gamers. Watching him thrive with family support while building on the foundation I'd created from family rejection was deeply satisfying. The Olympic recognition brought unprecedented attention to my work. Foreign governments invited me to consult on national esports development programs. Universities offered me honorary degrees for my contributions to legitimizing competitive gaming. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. My high school invited me to give the commencement address, specifically requesting that I speak about pursuing unconventional dreams despite family or societal pressure. Standing at the podium where I'd once been dismissed as a distracted student, addressing graduates who were entering a world where gaming careers were increasingly mainstream, felt like closing a crucial chapter. In my speech, I talked about the difference between support and approval, about building your own definition of success, about turning rejection into motivation to help others. I mentioned that some of their parents might not understand their dreams, but that didn't make those dreams less valid. After the ceremony, several parents approached me with questions about their own children's gaming interests, the same fears my parents had expressed 15 years earlier, but now with genuine curiosity about understanding rather than dismissing. One mother told me her son was obsessed with game design and she'd been pushing him toward engineering instead. After hearing my speech, she wanted to learn more about the creative and technical career opportunities in gaming. These conversations reminded me why my story had resonated so broadly. Every generation faces the challenge of pursuing careers their parents don't understand. Gaming was just one example of how quickly new industries could emerge and legitimize themselves. The Olympic esports trials were held 6 months later. Watching young athletes compete for the honor of representing their countries in games I'd helped establish as legitimate sports was surreal. Many of the competitors were Jake's age or younger, players who'd grown up in a world where gaming careers were increasingly accepted. They had family support, professional coaching, and clear pathways to success that my generation had to create from scratch. During the trials, I was interviewed about the evolution of competitive gaming. The reporter asked if I harbored any resentment toward my parents for their early lack of support. My answer surprised even me. I said that their rejection had forced me to develop independence and resilience that had ultimately made my success more meaningful, that I'd probably become a better advocate for young gamers because I'd experienced the alternative. That didn't excuse their behavior, but it had shaped me into someone who understood the importance of believing in people when they couldn't yet believe in themselves. My parents watched the interview from their living room. According to my grandmother, who still kept me updated on family news, my mother cried during the segment where I talked about turning pain into purpose. They'd never stopped trying to insert themselves into my success story, but I'd stopped needing them to acknowledge their mistakes. Their validation had become irrelevant to my sense of accomplishment. The first Olympic esports competition was a global sensation. Hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide watched as video game players competed for national pride and gold medals. The legitimacy my parents had once questioned was now unquestionable. I served as a commentator for several events, explaining strategies and player backgrounds to audiences who were experiencing competitive gaming for the first time. The kid who'd been kicked out for playing video games was now educating the world about esports. After the Olympics, my foundation received its largest donation ever, $50 million from a tech billionaire whose own son had faced family pressure to abandon gaming for traditional academics. He'd watched my story and wanted to ensure other families could access mediation and support services. The donation allowed us to expand globally, opening offices in countries where gaming careers faced even stronger cultural resistance than they had in America. We began working with families in conservative societies where any departure from traditional careers was seen as shameful. One of our most successful programs paired young gamers with volunteer families who'd already navigated the transition from skepticism to support. Jake's parents had become two of our most effective volunteer mentors. 5 years after the first Olympic gaming competition, I was inducted into the newly created Esports Hall of Fame. The ceremony was held in the same city where my parents had given me the ultimatum to choose between gaming and family. My acceptance speech focused on the thousands of young players who'd received support instead of ultimatums because families had learned from stories like mine that the greatest victory wasn't individual success, but collective progress toward understanding. My parents attended the ceremony uninvited, sitting in the back of the auditorium like proud relatives who'd always been supportive. The revisionist history had become so complete in their minds that they genuinely seemed to believe their own mythology. After the ceremony, they approached me with congratulations and pride, as if we'd always had a close relationship. Other attendees assumed they were the supportive parents who'd helped create an esports pioneer. I didn't correct them publicly, but I also didn't encourage the illusion. I thanked them politely and moved on to conversations with people who'd actually been part of my journey. The foundation's work had evolved beyond family mediation into broader advocacy for non-traditional career paths. We were helping families navigate children's interests in content creation, entrepreneurship, athletic pursuits, and artistic careers. Jake, now 28, had been promoted to executive director of our youth programs. He was engaged to a woman he'd met at a gaming tournament, and they were planning to start a family with the kind of support system he'd been fortunate to develop. At 35, I'd achieved everything I'd dreamed of as a 16-year-old and created institutions that would outlast my own career. The foundation would continue helping families long after I retired from competitive gaming. My parents were now in their 70s, still trying occasionally to reconnect, but no longer with the desperate urgency of people who needed to capitalize on my success. They'd found their own peace with our distant relationship. The angry teenager who'd packed his bags in defiance of an ultimatum had grown into someone who helped ensure other teenagers never faced that same impossible choice. The success they'd predicted would never come had become the foundation for helping thousands of families avoid the mistakes they'd made. Sometimes the most important victories aren't personal triumphs, but systemic changes that prevent others from experiencing the same pain you overcame. The parents who'd kicked me out for playing video games had accidentally created someone who ensured no other young gamer would have to choose between their dreams and their family's love. That transformation from rejection to advocacy, from personal pain to generational healing, felt like the most complete victory possible. The video games they dismissed as worthless had become the foundation for a legacy that would help families understand and support their children's unconventional dreams for generations to come. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong about you. It's making sure their mistakes become lessons that prevent others from suffering the same rejection. The gaming prodigy they'd rejected had grown into someone who made sure rejection like theirs would become increasingly rare. And that felt like the perfect ending to a story that had started with an ultimatum and evolved into a movement.